Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for our Democracy Town Hall. I'm Representative Tina Liebling. I'm really glad to have you here. And we are here this evening to talk about the very important topic of voting. So we all know that the freedom to vote is one of the foundations of our country. Voting, of course, determines who is going to be making policy, and that very directly determines what happens in people's lives. And secondly, we know that it's very important that votes are counted accurately by nonpartisan officials so that we can have confidence in the outcome of our elections. So I'm very excited tonight that we're going to have a good discussion here. I would like to ask everyone to please stay muted so that we can have a good discussion. And you can put questions in the chat if you're with us on Zoom. We do have some questions that have been submitted. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Representative Liz Bolden, who is going to make some comments and introduce our special guest. Representative Bolden.
Thank you. I too am really excited to be here this evening and to have this conversation on what is a really important and really timely topic. So we will talk about just a small d democracy and voting and a lot of topics within that. So just as Rep. Liebling said, this is really foundational to all other issues, and it is important to all Minnesotans. We are proud to have the highest voter turnout in the nation, and that's for a reason. This is important to all of us. And so really excited for this conversation. And sort of the plan for tonight is that we have a special guest with us in my colleague and friend, Rep. Emma Greenman. And I'll get to her just momentarily, but we'll have her give some comments about sort of the national stage of what's happening with voting rights and democracy at the national level. I'll make a few comments about what things look like here in Minnesota, in our state, and the work that has happened over the last session and the work that's yet to come. We do have some questions that have been submitted already, so we'll have a bit of discussion and go through those. And if you all have questions that arise over the course of our discussion, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will get to as many as we can. With that, I will next turn it over to Representative Emma Greenman, who represents part of Minneapolis and really is a national expert in this field. This is her life outside of the legislature. So we are so happy and excited to have her with us tonight. We're really, really fortunate to have her expertise. So with that, Rep. Greenman, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. And I am so grateful to be here with all of you. As Representative Bolden said, I represent South Minneapolis and Eastern Richfield and have the pleasure of serving with your two state representatives, with Tina and with Representative Liebling and Bolden. And I think, I am new to the legislature, but not new to this issue. And my background, I'm a voting rights lawyer, and I've spent the last 10 years on the front lines of this fight here in Minnesota and across the country, both at the federal level and in a set of states that I think really are on the tipping point, and many folks have been probably following in the news this year: Arizona, Georgia, Texas, Pennsylvania, Florida, Wisconsin, as well as a set of other states. And so what I thought we could start with is, and what I have been tasked to do is just sort of start with some of that national grounding, what's happening now and sort of where it fits in. I think what's really important, as Representative Bolden said, is, starting from a premise of our democracy works best when everyone has a voice from every community, where we come together to solve problems. We don't always agree, but we come together to create solutions that impact folks. And so with that, I think we have really rooted in the idea that every eligible person should be able to vote, and every vote should be counted, and that we should ensure that it is votes and voices of communities, and not big special interests or corporate dollars that are driving our politics. So what I think has happened in the last year, and I'd ask for the next slide, in the last, I'd say, decade or more, understanding that, this is a long fight, right? We are rooted in, we have been fighting to realize a democracy for the last 250 years. And in the last 10 years, there really has been two things pushing in the opposite directions. There has been real movement to increase the voice of voters and in our elections by protecting the freedom to vote at the federal and the state level. So you've seen pushes in red states and blue states and purple states for automatic voter registration to restore the right to vote for folks living in our community who have previously been incarcerated, on things like voting by mail and ensuring that folks have information they need in the language they need it. You've seen that all over. Increasing ballot access and security. We have seen really big pushes, as well as a really robust effort and really for the public demanding that we look at the role that money, dark money and corporate money is playing in our elections. And then I'd say that, and I've seen this, you've seen this in a bunch of states, a real effort to change the way we redistrict to ensure that redistricting is fair and representative and everyone has an equal voice. So there were ballot initiatives in Missouri and in Michigan, in places all over the country. But we've also seen a real push in the opposite direction, a push that diminishes the voice of voters and the power of the public in our democracy. So we have seen restrictions on the freedom to vote and creating deliberate barriers to voting, like provisional balloting, voter ID, voting purges, and a set of barriers. We've seen an attempt to have partisan interference with nonpartisan elections administration and ballot counting. Since Citizens United, we've seen a decrease in transparency and restrictions on corporate money in our politics. And what we saw in the 2010 election, after the 2010 election in 2011 and 2012 was the rise of pretty extreme partisan and racial gerrymandering that really limited the ability of voters to have a say and to ensure that their votes were determining the outcome of the election. So in that context, we came to 2020, and DJ asked for the next slide. So I think it is probably not an overstatement to say that 2020 really tested the infrastructure of our democracy. We conducted an election in a global pandemic and saw the real heroism of folks in Minnesota. We have 30,000 folks, election administrators, election judges, folks who many of you may on this Zoom or listening probably participated, who went out to make sure that folks could vote and really put their health on the line. And with that, we had record voter turnout here in Minnesota and across the country. And it really was a real feat of a strength by voters and the folks who power our elections. This year, it was the most diverse electorate in the history of our country as well. And it was the most secure election in American history, according to then Trump's Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice. So in a really tough situation, we saw a successful election. 3.3 million Minnesotans turned out to make their voices heard. And in most districts in the state, that was record turnout. But we also saw disinformation and the big lie of voter fraud really cause some real, both real and perceived threats to our election system. Disinformation that led to the January 6th insurrection at our Capitol to try to interfere with the certification of a presidential election, and also led to 6 people being killed or dying. We also saw the national wave of anti-voter bills and election subversion bills. So as a result of that high turnout and that 2020 election, this spring in many legislators across the country, legislatures, we saw a rise, a huge flood of efforts to create intentional barriers to the ballot. And we've seen rising threats and also fear amongst local elections administrators, folks who simply administer the elections and count the ballots, because they've been targeted by some of this disinformation and by this fear. And so in that context of 2020, and in what we have seen in 2021 is, and this is a map from the Brennan Center for Justice, of the states that that passed voter restrictions just this year, so in the last couple of months. There were, in 48 states, there were voter restrictions introduced, and in this set of states, they were actually passed. And we're talking about, and if folks have been following the news, in Georgia, in Florida, in Arizona, in Texas, a set of pretty extreme measures that restrict laws that have been used in some cases for a long time, that give access to people being able to vote by mail, being able to vote where they live, and have restricted that. We have also seen a set of bills that have really been about allowing more partisan interference in the work of freely and fairly counting those ballots. So with that, I think that we have work on our hands. But the good news is, and I think that the real imperative is that there is a real broad push in the public and in some of our leaders at the federal level and in Minnesota to really have an agenda that focuses on increasing the voices and the power of voters in taking on the issues of the big money and the dark money in our politics, and ensuring that that our districts are freely and fairly drawn. And so with that, one of the things I'm sort of excited about that we're doing here in Minnesota, but also at the federal level, we have seen a big push, and Representative Bolden and I were actually out in Washington, D.C. with state legislators from around the country, advocating for the bill that's called the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that really would create a national standard. So ensuring that every voter in America has access to a lot of things that we already have here in Minnesota, but some things that we don't. And would strengthen the freedom to vote, would strengthen voter registration, would provide equitable voter access, and would take on the issue that big money is playing in our politics. At the state level, we have a bill called the Democracy for the People Act, which has a similar agenda, but really is focused on Minnesota elections and building on our strong and proud tradition of high participation, of inclusive democracy, to ensure that we are protecting the system that has really gotten us to first in the nation voter turnout, but that we are really invested in strengthening it to ensure that every Minnesotan, every person has a voice in our democracy, and that we are really rooting our policy and our policymaking in Minnesota voters. So I think with that, I will turn it back over to Representative Bolden.
Yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate that sort of framing and kind of view of what's happening at that federal level. And I would just emphasize, there's a lot happening in that space. And as Rep. Greenman mentioned, she and I were in DC maybe 3-ish weeks ago there was legislators over, I'm not going to remember the number now, but over 100, I think, certainly from, I think, over 35 states advocating for action at the federal level. And so certainly there absolutely is movement in this space. And so if we then narrow it down a little bit and talk a little bit about what is happening here in Minnesota, there is a lot happening here as well. And that is in large part to the work of Rep. Greenman and the work that she has done with House File 9, which I'll speak to a little bit. So she is the chief author of that bill that was authored at this last session in our state legislature. And I was happy to support that and be the author of the clone bill. When in the House, if there is a bill, I think we'd have 35 folks sign on to a bill. So when bills are very, very popular and more than 35 people want to sign on to them, we do what is called a clone bill, so more people can support. So I'll talk, that's a big bill, and there's a lot of things included in that. And I got some notes so I don't forget pieces, but I'll talk a little bit about what is included in that. But I will also note that there was a lot of discussion. There was a lot of work done over the course of the session. There were many hearings, hours of testimony. There were folks brought in from all corners of the state, and from all different backgrounds, students and clergy and election officials, and really to get that sort of broad perspective and conversation around really what the people of Minnesota are asking for, and how do we strengthen democracy for everyone, with the goal of everyone's voice being able to be heard, because we know that's so important and that's what Minnesotans want. So many hours of committee hearings and testimony. There was good discussion on the House floor. And so, there's that, again, that juxtaposition of what we were able to pass in the House versus sort of the very different vision that we see in the Senate. And as Emma spoke about on her slide, one of those first slides with the kind of the different paths, one being expansion of voting opportunities, making it easy, eliminating barriers for people to be able to safely and easily cast their votes, regardless of race or place, whether that be from home or early or in person or on actual election day, having those opportunities. And with the other sort of vision, that which we see in the Senate of really increasing those barriers and making it more difficult for folks. And so as we think about House File 9, I sort of envision three sort of major categories of that. The first being voting rights, and again, decreasing those barriers for people. One of those being voter registration, automatic voter registration, making it easier for folks to have that registration and pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds who, as I talk to young folks all the time, they are engaged and excited about voting. And so making sure that they have easy access into the process. Also making sure that people living in our communities who are on probation and parole, making sure that they can vote, that every Minnesotan has that equal access to the ballot. And then prohibiting intimidation and harassment of election workers. And that was something I heard quite a bit of concern with and worry about in the 2020 election. Folks who are doing this work are this is how the system runs. We are grateful for these people doing this work. We need people to continue to step up and want to do that and be sure that our elections run smoothly, and they should absolutely not be harassed or intimidated or treated poorly. The second bucket I sort of think of with this bill is money in politics. And again, this is something I hear from constituents and voters quite a bit, is that our democracy and government should serve and respond to Minnesotans, not big corporations or the very wealthy. And, we Minnesotans want transparency and around money in politics, and to get that dark money out of politics. And so, we should know who's donating where, as far as big corporations and that dark money. And then the third sort of bucket I think of is about redistricting. And I think we'll probably have a little bit more discussion about this later. But, making sure that Minnesotans are choosing their elected officials and not the other way around, that we have fair districts and a transparent process with that, and how those lines are drawn. And we're seeing that. We're in the midst of that right now with the results of the census and that redistricting happening before the upcoming election now. And Rep. Greenman sits on that redistricting committee. So I think we'll have a bit of discussion of sort of where things stand right now, perhaps in a bit. But that's very high level of some of the things that are included in that very big bill with a lot of detail, but a lot of thoughtful work has gone into that with the goal of, again, just strengthening democracy, making sure that everybody's voice can be heard and everybody has easy access to the ballot. And so, given that we are the only state in the country with a divided legislature, it is a challenge to get some things across the finish line. And so certainly all of those pieces did not make it across the finish line. But so there is more work to do, and this work of strengthening democracy is ongoing work. And so we will, that work will continue. Anything, Rep. Greenman, that that I missed that you would want to fill in there?
No, I was just going to say, though, that, one of the things that's really important about this, and that we did when we did these hearings on House File 9 and on a set of other democracy reforms, is actually listen to the public and to local elections administrators and experts. But we heard, and I've spent a lot of time with the folks who, election judges, with the local elections administrators, the county administrators, and the folks that are Secretary of State's office, to really understand what is best for voters, and also what is best to implement a free, fair, and efficient election. And so a lot of these pieces, there's some there's things we talk about a lot that are really important. There's also some reforms that are really about ensuring that the 30,000 folks who help our elections run can do so in a way that both instills trust and also allows them to do their jobs. And so just if any of you on this watching out there were like, we had dozens of people come testify from all over the state. Encourage you, if you're interested in this, to come testify in the future. But just really, this is all rooted in Minnesotans and in the folks who really have first-line knowledge of how we can do our job better and how we can ensure that our elections represent everyone and the voices and votes of everyone in the state.
Yeah, thank you for that. All right, so we're going to get into a few questions here. The first one we maybe have spoke a little bit about, but I'll let anybody jump back in here. So what do you think are the biggest challenges facing democracy here in Minnesota? And what are some of the opportunities?
So I think that the challenge that we see nationally is the challenge we see in Minnesota, because the threats we see, some of the policies that we've seen pushed by the Republican majority in the Senate are not unique to Minnesota. It's actually a national push, a very well-funded national push to restrict access to the ballot and to diminish the voices of the public. And so when we think about some of the disinformation, the fear that's being created for elections administrators, all of that is baked in. And so I think what's important is that in Minnesota, we say we're going to lean into our proud traditions, and really support our nonpartisan local elections administration. I think we have a real opportunity. People are engaged in a way that I have never seen before. In redistricting, as a voting rights lawyer, I used to talk about it 10 years ago and people's eyes would glaze over. But I think now this is a real opportunity to really engage. You all are here to engage your neighbors and to really say, how can we work together to strengthen our systems? And, we were one of the first states with same-day registration. We were one of the first states with a public financing system that allows voters to support the folks to ensure that grassroots candidates can run. Many of those are over 40 years old. And so our opportunity now is to say, it's 2021, let's invest in really being our 21st century vision of what the freedom to vote looks like, what the freedom to participate looks like. And I think that there's lots of ways to do it, but it is really, Minnesota can really lead here, because if we lean into our traditions and also understand that it's on us to build an inclusive democracy, to build one where we are eliminating the disparities, the racial disparities in participation, that we are ensuring that young folks are voting at the same rates and participating at the same rates, that we are ensuring that if new Americans and folks that speak a different language can have a welcoming, those citizens can have a welcoming face and information at the polling places. All of those things are really our opportunities for us to lead on as a state.
I think that's exactly right. That aligns with what I hear from constituents and people in my district as well. And I think in my view, democracy is a verb. It's not something that's just sort of is static and it's like we've done democracy. It just doesn't work that way. Like we have to like keep at it and continue. And that innovation piece, I think, is a really good point. That's I guess maybe I didn't realize that a lot of the things we have in place are, have been sort of in the place and the way that they are for the last 40 years. So it makes sense. I think we do have opportunities to look at things different and be a leader in this space as we are. Again, in Minnesota, we consistently have the highest voter turnout across the country. Minnesotans are engaged and they care about this. And so, this is really an issue that everybody is invested in and for good reason. All right. Next question. In decades past, Minnesota has passed innovative democracy reforms. This is maybe a little along the same lines. What are some things we can do to lead again across our democracy? So similar. Anything else you would add?
I think that there's some specific policy pieces and actually some states that we now can learn from. Colorado has done some really innovative work in ensuring that they have automatic voter registration. They also have access to the ballot, that you can vote at a polling place, at home, where you live. So I think that there is a whole set of opportunities to expand voter registration and reduce those disparities. The other thing I would say, and we don't talk about this as much, but really taking on the issue of money in our politics is really critical. And it's something I know that I'm talking to both of you, you hear a lot about, I hear a lot about in my district. I know at the congressional and the federal level, I've talked to our senators and our Congress folks who hear about it too. One of the things that House File 9 does, and that is learning from the experience of Seattle and other places, is taking what we have, which is if folks have used the political contribution refund, which is if $50 that any voter can give to any candidate that accepts some limits and participates in our public financing system of any of your choice. What this policy will do was turn that into a coupon, so that instead of having to set out $50, you would actually get a coupon and can give $25 or $50 to any candidate of your choice. This will increase the power that voters have to really power our elections. And also what it means for grassroots candidates is that folks can spend time talking to constituents and voters in their district rather than raising money out of with big donors or with PACs and stuff. And so I think that there's a lot of that is learning from other places that are really trying new things and listening to those experiences. But there's some really exciting, innovative things that are in this bill and that also we can do together.
I think that's such a good point. As you said, I do hear often from folks, concerned about that whole dark money piece. And I think it's a really good point of, campaigns should be, funded from, grassroots, from the people, from constituents, from voters, and not from, big corporations or those dark money pieces. And I think, that PCR program is something I think not everybody realizes is out there. And there is a difference. The current program, people, donate $50 and they get that $50 back from the state within, I think, a couple of weeks, generally, maybe on average. But not everybody is able to come out of pocket with $50 and can give that up for a couple of weeks. And so changing that process to a coupon process, I think, is one of those innovative things and makes it more inclusive, right? That makes it accessible to everybody to be able to utilize that program.
I'd just like to jump in for 1 second and just to add that in my experience in the legislature, it really does matter who is funding campaigns. And when we're talking about dark money, I think a lot of times we're talking about issue campaigns, not legislative campaigns or local elections. But it really does matter if people are able to get their campaigns funded from voters, or if they have to or do go to the big special interests. So if you want your elected officials at whatever level to be thinking about you, thinking about what is going to be best for the vast majority of the people that they represent, and not about what's going to help a special interest. This issue about funding campaigns and getting more funding, more of the funding from individual donors is super important.
Yeah, I think that's so true. Next, I want to talk about, as we've mentioned, our high voter turnout. So how can we improve Minnesota's tradition of high voter turnout and reduce disparities in voter participation?
So this is where, and the organizer in me and the voting rights lawyer in me says two things. We need to make sure that our election system is accessible, that we are reducing barriers, we are making it safe and secure and welcoming so that folks come out, so that people feel like their vote counts, so that we're counting votes fairly. And we need the partnership with all of the folks who do the work, right? The League of Women Voters, many community groups, everybody who are going out and actually engaging voters. Because the number one way to get someone to vote is to ask them and welcome them in. So there are policies like automatic voter registration, like reducing the barriers for student voting on campus, like increasing the opportunity to vote where folks live, and ensuring that that those information about voting is in multiple languages. We can do all that, and then we need to really say that voting is about people's exercising their power. And that means that the organizing that goes into ensuring that folks not only vote, but then show up in partnership as we are making policy, as we are making decisions at every level of government, are really important. And so I think that that is the key. That has been the key in Minnesota. We've had strong civic organizations, strong political organizations, strong nonprofit organizations that have all really invested in engaging voters. And I think that piece is not something you can legislate, but I think we need to make sure that our policies and our structures ensure that folks have free and fair access.
Yeah, I think that's so true. It also just reminds me, as you talk about, all the, different kind of groups, nonprofit groups, and, that reminds me that, this is not a partisan issue. It's not a bipartisan issue. It's really a nonpartisan issue. The policies that we're talking about and the work that we're talking about here isn't a Democrat or Republican issue. It's really nonpartisan. It's a people issue. It's a citizen issue. It's a democracy issue, which really isn't partisan. Anything else you would add to that?
I think you said it perfectly.
Fair enough. I'm going to switch back to the sort of the dark money in politics piece a little bit, as we had another question about that. So again, Minnesotans are concerned that there is too much dark money in politics. What else can we do about this to sort of make this more transparent, add some sunlight to the process?
Yeah, and I think that this, again, when we talk about disclosure and transparency of money in our politics, I think that there was a poll in Minnesota, and 82% of Minnesotans wanted the state legislature to increase the disclosure, increase the transparency. It's similar at the national level, because we really, at the end of the day, voters should know who is spending money in our politics, whether it's, if folks are giving directly to candidates, you actually know all of that. We have campaign rules that require a full disclosure. But really what we're talking about is, since Citizens United, there's been a set of independent spending that has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And the Supreme Court has made it easier and easier to spend. And in Minnesota, our laws haven't kept up. We haven't really revised them when it comes to transparency and disclosure in the Citizens United era, and Citizens United was over a decade ago. And so one of the things that is in House Bill 9, and also a set of states have started to do, is require, with independent expenditures, you have to actually disclose your top 3 donors, and you got to put that on your advertising, on your TV ad or in your radio ad, so we know who's paying for it. That is a piece of it. We also need to make sure that our digital, the Facebook and social and YouTube, that is increasingly being used and is very hard to track, unlike if you put an ad up on TV or the radio, it is much more targeted. We need to make sure that there's disclosures that go on that, and that we know, people know who are funding those ads, and who created them. So those are two pieces that are really about common sense things that ensure that voters have the information they need to know who's putting up an ad and who's funding an ad, and not hide behind names like, Minnesotans for hot dish and like everybody loves freedom. And so ensuring we have that, I think, is really critical. And it's another place where Minnesota, we just need to make sure that our laws are keeping up with. And I know the other piece is that there is movement at the federal level for the same kind of policy that would affect federal elections as well.
I think that's such a great point, especially the point about social media and how our laws need to keep up with, current times and what's really happening. Certainly within the last, I don't know, decade, certainly. Facebook has become, such more of a big player in terms of, just where people are getting their information for one, but also, political advertising as well. So when it is difficult to know who's behind that, those ads and that disinformation sometimes, it really does, it's really a disservice to citizens, to all of us. Yeah, I think that's a great point.
And then I would also just add, this is a federal thing, but I know that many people, I get contacted about it a lot, and I think support a constitutional amendment that would deal with Citizens United. Until we do that, Citizens United prevents us from being able to do some of the more robust regulation that we need to do to ensure that it's voters and not corporations or special interests that are really driving our politics. So there is also a push at the national level to have a constitutional amendment that would deal with Citizens United, and that is another thing happening. But we can't do it at the state level.
Yeah, if people aren't familiar with Citizens United, do you want to give just a brief kind of explanation of what you mean by that?
Yes, thank you for that. So Citizens United was a Supreme Court case, and it was one in a long line of Supreme Court cases where basically the Supreme Court, in a set of cases, said that money is so much like speech that really, if you're giving to a candidate or a party, we can regulate it, but any organization that is spending outside of that is doing it independently. Has virtually no rules. Now, it is constitutional to have transparency and disclosure, but it really became impossible for states or the federal government to limit how much of that independent money is flowing into our politics. And so that issue of how much and regulating it really will have to be solved by a constitutional amendment. But what we can do is ensure that every dollar that is spent in our elections, that voters know about, the voters can make decisions about. And that is some of the disclosure and transparency reforms that are so supported by the public for reasons that Liz mentioned.
Perfect, thank you. All right, I'm going to keep us, we've got lots of good questions here, so I'm going to keep us moving to the next question here. So one of my concerns is that it's very confusing for people who have been convicted of a crime in the past to determine whether they are eligible to vote. Has there been any progress on legislation to state if they are incarcerated, can they vote? If they are not incarcerated, can they vote?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. And I know Representative Liebling's been in the legislature long enough to know that this is an issue that has been, that we have heard about, that there's been bipartisan support for. If folks are living in our community, if folks are on probation and parole, and in Minnesota, people are on probation and parole for a long time, they should be able to vote if they're paying taxes and their kids are in our school and they're in our community. And for that reason, the question actually gets at a good point, which is we hear from elections administrators a lot too of it's really hard. It's hard to administer election. People don't know if they're still what's called on papers, but in the system or not. I was a public defender and I had clients that would ask me that question from things that had happened a decade before. And so it is both a moral issue and an election administration issue. We need to restore the right to vote for folks once they are leaving incarceration. That has hit a roadblock in the Senate, but there is bipartisan support. And we have also seen in Florida in 2018, they passed the ballot initiative, in Virginia. And so this is a place where there's actually national momentum. So please keep making noise about it. It is really critical that we get this done for the folks, because those voices are really needed. To the point of, it's really confusing, and we need to ensure that folks can have access to the ballot.
Thank you for that. All right, next question. I work with teens on civic engagement issues. Is it fair to say that both political parties take advantage of gerrymandering if they can? If not, can you give me examples of why one party is more likely to do this than another?
I'm happy to take this. So as somebody with my national hat on, is, gerrymandering is something people have been talking a lot about in the last 10 years, but it is hundreds of years old. So the idea that, and then there's different kinds. There's, and what we have seen in the last 10 years is really extreme partisan gerrymandering. And that has really been led and pioneered by the Republican Party in the last 10 years. But we have seen incumbent protection gerrymandering. We have seen racial gerrymandering since about the time that people started districting. So there's nothing, there's no party has a long history. That being said, and I think what if you look at the last 10 years and you look at what's happening right now is there has, in response to the public, what we saw in 2010 was really a new level of partisan gerrymandering, of extreme partisan gerrymandering that we've never seen before, really driven at the national level by national folks in the Republican Party. We have not seen that on the Democratic side. In 2020, and here's what I would say for folks who care about redistricting, the proof is in the process. And in 2020, and as we create new maps with the 2020 data, what folks should be and what you should be asking for, you should be asking all of us at the legislature, is a process that goes out and listens to voters and to communities, that establishes a set of principles, a set of fair principles about how we're going to do these maps, and that really ensures one person, one vote in a fair and transparent process. And I think that there is a good conversation to have. I have been a supporter of independent redistricting commissions. We are going to see those play out. They are not the panacea, because there's places where they've actually been distorted in some places like Arizona. But I think that generally they're a good idea. But that should not hold, lawmakers should be able to draw fair maps. And we are committed to that in the House. And what I was going to say, I saw this question come in the chat. I'm going to put in the link, but the House is doing a set of hearings before we even draw a map to listen to folks in every congressional district. We're taking testimony for folks to come and tell us about their community, the things that matter, how they define and what good representation looks like to them. So there is on September 15th, from 8:30 to 10:30, there is one for the first congressional district. I think all of Rochester is in the first congressional district. And then we are going to have a later hearing that sort of gets everybody at the end if folks can't make that one. I'm going to put that in the chat, but we would love to hear your voice and folks who are doing this work, because it is really critical that we're drawing maps based on what we hear people telling us and how we can best represent the state of Minnesota. So I'm going to put that in the chat.
Thank you for that.
Right,
we can be sure we get that communicated out in other ways too, so people can be aware of that date, September 15th, you said. I think that's so important, and I'm so grateful that we are using that process to go out into districts and hear from people and hear from communities, because that should really, as you said, that should be how it works. That we are making decisions based on the will of the people, and so how do we know that but to go out and ask them? So I'm grateful for that, and encourage everybody to take part in that as you're able. Very good. The next question goes to voter ID. The person who submitted the question here is in favor of the voter ID requirement. And so can you, let's see, I can think of several ways to enable easily granting a valid voter ID. Why not, basically, why not pursue or provide such a process, to require voter ID?
So we are really in the focused on strengthening and not restricting access to the ballot. And what that means is really both listening to Minnesotans and figuring out what works to make sure that we have safe and accurate elections and that they are accessible to the most people. In Minnesota in 2012, voter ID was on the ballot. Photo ID was on the ballot, and Minnesotans rejected it. And so I think that that is the strongest poll that I have to say that that's not really the right direction. We have a set of policies in place to verify where folks verify both their identity and their address. That has worked in Minnesota for for the history, but for 45 years since we've had same-day registration. And that's really where we're going to be focused. I think that there's lots of good ways. And one of the really important ways is through automatic voter registration. If we can get folks on the rolls seamlessly when they're interacting with the DMV or getting a state ID, it's just another way that we can strengthen people's access to the ballot and also strengthen the security and safety that people feel. And so again, I follow the voices of Minnesotans, and Minnesotans came out in an election and rejected that. And so we're really focused on things that strengthen folks.
Yeah, I think that's so right. That really was, it is the will of the people. It was put out and resoundingly, shot down. I think too, good policy is, enacted to solve a problem. And I don't think we should, my view is I don't think we should be developing policy in search of a problem, as you just said. Muted myself, sorry. We have very secure and fair elections and have for decades. And so appreciate that background. All right, next question. Scrolling, apologies. A little bit about security. So it's hard to vote and protect people's privacy, especially with the data kept on people, where they are, how they vote, being available to anyone for purchase. Will the law change to protect and provide safety measures for those needing it?
So this is a question. So currently our law protects, you can't get an access to the voter list unless you're in a category of people and really using it for sort of political or outreach engagement. This is a challenge we have just generally about as more and more data is available in all of the commercial and sort of ways that things are tracking us, our phones and our email traffic and all of that stuff. It just becomes harder and harder to answer these questions. And I think it's a really good one, which is right now in Minnesota, how you vote, who you vote for, all of that. That is, we have a secret ballot that's not recorded anywhere. The partisan pieces in our presidential primary, the legislature went and ensured that is private. But as it relates to all of the privacy issues, I think it's really important that we are looking at those because, like all these other places, as the commercial and the outside world continue to compile more data on us, not through our official channels, but through all of the other ways, it's really critical that the law keeps up. And so I think that I am interested, if whoever wrote that question, I think that Representative Liebling and Representative Bolden and I and others would be really interested in talking about how we could ensure that voters feel that their privacy is protected, and also that our system has what it needs to administer a good election.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. A question from Facebook came in. Any idea how we can ensure that electoral winners demonstrate that they are supported by a majority of the voters? Because majority rule is an important fundamental concept. This has come up. It puts me in mind of the filibuster in the federal Senate, of how, you know, that's a sort of an offshoot of this. But any thoughts about that majority rule concept?
No, I mean, I think that there's different systems and there's different ways to do it. I think that what is important is that and what we are facing in a lot of places is not the issue of 50% plus one, but the issue of someone winning an election and rules that allow partisan interference to actually overturn the will of the voters. To me, what is really critical is that we understand the will of the voters and that we look at how election systems affect that. So like what we know and that we are looking at both the way that they impact traditionally marginalized groups. So in Georgia, they have a runoff election. And part of the reason that they have a runoff election to get to 50% plus one was to actually diminish and dilute the power of Black voters. That is not the case in every place, but I think what I would say is that the election law lawyer in me says that every system we have, we really need to say, is this really capturing what the will of the voter is, and is this ensuring that everybody has equal access to helping win? I think when you come to the filibuster, we have a set of that is a minoritarian rule, I would say, which is in that case we have a Senate that overrepresents a smaller part of the country. And then on top of that, the filibuster says you need to get 60 votes to do anything. I think that the majority of Americans are frankly frustrated with that because we elect people to do things. And if you have 10 votes that can hold everything up at any point, it just doesn't, it grinds everything to a halt. I don't know how you two feel about that. Those are real questions for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Liebling, did you want to jump in there?
Well, I wonder, I wasn't sure if the question was asking a little bit about our system of voting here in Minnesota and how we can be so sure that our system, that we count the votes and they are what gets counted and so on. And my understanding is that Minnesota has a very secure system because, in fact, if all of you who voted in Minnesota, we in fact vote on a paper ballot and it gets fed into a machine that counts it. But those ballots are all there to be verified. And Representative Greenman, I wonder if you could just discuss that a little bit. Like, we have, to my understanding, a very strong system for that in Minnesota. And until this year, when the big lie became such a prevalent thing, I'd never heard anybody even suggest that we didn't. So could you maybe talk about that?
Yeah, I appreciate that because I do think, I don't know if folks have been hearing this sort of a flurry of what I would call the sort of audit scam, what we saw in Arizona and we saw pushed in Pennsylvania. In Minnesota, we actually have a very strong elections administration protocol before, during, and after the count. And most of it is public and it is in our statute. And so when you before we have an election, all 87 counties elections administrators test their equipment and do sort of the industry standard testing that I am not an expert on, but and that is open to the public. And then once we have an election, before an election can be certified, all 87 counties will do a selected recount of precinct, or a selected hand count, excuse me, not recount, of precincts. And if there is any disparities, they will then do a selected or a hand count of the entire election. We also have a recount law that we've used both in very, very close elections like Senator Franken and Governor Dayton. In some elections, actually, we saw last week at this, or 2 weeks ago in Brooklyn Center, we had a few of those in the state legislature, and they have worked pretty seamlessly, given that we're talking about only a couple of ballots. And then every 87 counties, the local elections administrators certify their elections. And so like most other places in the country, our local elections are really, the ballots are counted and certified by a set of administrators, nonpartisan administrators at the local level who really do this day in and day out. And we have very strong laws. The reason I call it an audit scam is that there's actually no, what is behind it is both conspiracy and disinformation that is really about discrediting an election, the 2020 election that the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, 60 courts said was free and fair and found no evidence of voter fraud. And so what it is about, it is not about those ballots. It is about undermining people's faith and confidence. And it's about 2022 and 2024. And if folks want to read a little more about what's happening in Arizona, it is a private company that has no experience in auditing, being privately funded by dark money that they're not exactly sure who's funding it, by partisan interests. And so when we think about how we should do it the way that we did it, and frankly, the way that that every state in the country did it, which according to their long statutes, by nonpartisan elections administrators at the local level who go through the process, that is public. So I really appreciate the question. I think that there's been a lot of misinformation about this, but folks should feel confident and really grateful, I'd say, for the folks in 87 counties who have really been doing the work and doing the work well.
Yeah, thank you for that. Great points. Okay, I'm going to try and sneak in one last question, and then we will wrap up because I want to be respectful of everyone's time and end on time here. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions. We got a couple of questions on ranked choice voting, and we know that that is working well in a couple of local elections and city elections across the state. And so, is there, the question essentially is there any movement, or how do we get that expanded statewide? And so, to that, I will, and welcome anybody else to join in, but I will just say that there was there has been a bill for that to occur. And certainly in the last session, I have heard from many of you. I get quite a few emails about this. Many folks are certainly in favor of this. It did not cross the finish line in our session this last year. I anticipate it will continue to come up again, and we'll continue to have discussion about it. I would say if that is something that's important to you, reach out to your elected officials, those who represent you, and let them know that that's something that's important to you. Anything else that?
No, I would just add that I think what we saw at the state level this year is in the Senate, not support, but we saw them in their bill that they sent to conference committee. So in the bill that they passed off the Senate floor, an attempt to preempt local elections, local jurisdictions who currently use ranked choice voting from doing that. And it really is, I think it is very critical. We learn a lot from what folks are doing at the local level and trying different systems and really ensuring that it works before we do stuff at the state level. And so we fought hard, and that did not end up in the bill. So the states, the local jurisdictions that have decided to use ranked choice voting can continue to do that. And I think we all are going to continue to learn from those places about what works and what doesn't work in our systems.
Great. All right, well, I think we will end it there with questions because I do want to try and end on time here. I just want to give a huge thank you to you, Rep. Greenman, for coming and spending this hour with us. This has been Really a great discussion, and I have learned things, and I hope those of you on the call have as well. If you had a question that we didn't get to, there are a couple that I'm aware of and probably a few others that I'm not. Please feel free to reach out to any of us. Happy to chat with you about this topic or really any others. I know Rep. Liebling and I are both very accessible, so please feel free to send us an email or reach out to us. We would love to chat with you. And so again, I just thank you for attending and submitting your questions. This is really a timely and important topic, and we appreciate your engagement. And with that, I'll toss it back to Rep. Liebling.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I would add my thanks to Representative Greenman, and she's a terrific colleague and leader on this topic in the legislature. It's been, well, here I am with the two incredible freshman legislators. I mean, we are so fortunate. And we're so fortunate to live in Minnesota, where we do have really, we have all these fantastic, as Representative Greenman was saying, all these election officials and so many people who just work really hard to make things run well. And Minnesota really has been a state that works, you know, going back to when Wendy Anderson held up the fish on the cover of Time. This is a very good state. I just wanted to add to what Representative Bolden said, that when you write to us, email is often the best way, certainly to contact me. And we do ask folks to give us their mailing address, their street address. And I just want to say the reason we do that is to know that you are our constituent. We don't share your address with anybody. We don't put you on any mailing list. But it is helpful to us because we get mail from everywhere. And if we know you're our constituent, we want to know so that we can respond to you and engage with you and understand that your opinion on something is more important than the opinion of somebody from some other state. So with that, thank you all again. And we are delighted to do this. We're delighted to hear from you. And I hope that we'll have the opportunity to do more of these, and let us know if you would like us to do more. So thank you, everybody. And thank you to DJ and our staff for helping us get this together. It's a lot of work for them, and we really appreciate it. So have a good night, everyone.